Hello and welcome. My name is Larry Arnn. We're here in the Richardson Heritage Room of the Mossy Library of Hillsdale College. This is a series of discussions of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution of the United States and how they're related. This is the third in the series, and we're talking about the largest arrangements in the Constitution of the United States, which begin with representation, and now we're going to talk about how that gives rise and makes possible other major arrangements, including separation of powers and limited government. Please watch. We were talking about representation and how it gives rise to other major constitutional arrangements. And you can see how the Constitution becomes a big fact in a country that's governed under such a document, because it shapes behavior in big ways. It comes to have a big influence on how we think about our jobs as citizens. For example, there's an old pattern that's been available since we've had political polling, which is 70 or 80 years now, where public opinion gets much more focused and much better informed about public issues as elections draw near. It's shaping the behavior of people. And we've already made the comment that it makes possible representation, makes possible a way to separate sovereignty from government so that sovereignty is outside. It makes possible a way to have a large republic, because you can't have a little democracy be a big country, because people couldn't get together. And it makes possible a kind of deliberative politics. That is to say, we can think a long time. And we kind of have to think, because it's a big country, and because we talk, and we need to talk in front of a whole lot of people. We need to try to be fair. Either that or we have to be really good liars. But Lincoln said one time, it's hard to have a good enough memory to be a really good liar. And then also, it doesn't really let us do anything except talk for long periods of time. Those are features of the government of the United States as it looks like from outside the government. From inside the government, the great feature is separation of powers. And that's an incredibly powerful device that has both enormous influence on how our government works and enormous impacts on the content and direction of things that are decided in the government so long as it is preserved. You can see why you would have to have representation, representative form of government, to have separation of powers, because it's pretty simple. If the sovereign were inside the government, it would dominate the government. In Athens, it's not like the people all got together in their assembly, you know, holding the authority to govern in Athens. It's a democracy. It's not like they'd get together and get in a big rout and pass something, and then some king would come in and say, no, no, you can't do that. When they're together, they can do whatever they want. And so if you've got a representative system where the sovereignty is outside, then the branches can be equal. Equal in strength, equal in authority. And in our system, because probably the Constitution of the United States is the most sophisticated system of separation of powers ever put in place. And the reasons for that are explained in the Federalist Papers by Hamilton mainly, Madison mainly, and also Hamilton. And what they did was, they did something really clever. They mixed up the powers some. And that way, and they take great pride in this, and that way, no one part of the government is likely to be able to dominate another. And I'll give you some examples. First of all, you really have to understand federalism as a parallel part of the overall system of separation of powers as it emerged from the Constitutional Convention. It wasn't exactly the plan of anybody that it would work that way, but they saw shortly after that it was going to work that way. Because you've got a sovereign, and it's one thing, it's the people, and they now delegate authority. And they delegate executive authority to the executive branch, and they delegate legislative authority to the legislative branch, and by indirect election, they delegate judicial authority to the judicial branch, but also it's actually true that most government in America, until well into the 20th century, well into the 20th century, was actually state and local government. And so that becomes a different delegation of power from the people to a branch of government. And that means, by the way, something neat happens there. It means that collecting the garbage and local welfare systems and that stuff used to all be local. Education was local, very large, always in American history, but locally controlled, as was most everything in domestic politics. And that's a lot of government. And that was separated from the great business of the national government, which really boiled down mainly to defense, a national system of open and free commerce, and the ability of the federal government to speak for the nation in the world. Those are the main things that it did. And that meant that the people, in their wisdom, had given these different authorities to these different places, and they weren't all combined in the same hands. And I say they were mixed, these powers, and I'll tell you how. In the case of the states, of course, there was great concern that this new, stronger federal government under the Constitution of the United States would eat up the states. And James Madison gave the obvious answer to that. The states' legislatures are going to elect the members of the Senate of the United States. So that gives them a foothold in the federal government that will let them protect their interests. The Senate won't pass anything that the state legislature doesn't like. And that will constitute a check on the size of the federal government. Now, that came to an end with the 17th Amendment, and there's no estimating the importance of that amendment to the changes in our constitutional fabric in America. But that ability of the state to control the Senate is just like the ability, is parallel to the ability of the president to have a check on what the Congress can do to him, because he has a veto power. And if you think about it, that gives him a portion of the votes in the Congress, really, because the Congress can pass a bill by 50%, but it has to override a veto by the president, it has to vote by 2/3. And that means that's 1/6, the difference between those two things. It's like the president is controlling 1/6 of the votes of the legislature. And the founders are concerned that the legislature will be a dangerous branch because it's closest to the sovereign. And get this in your head, it's a very important thing. The people who built our republic really believed that whoever was using power, the one, the few, or the many, was likely to abuse it. And the great test is, will they use it well? In our country, where sovereignty is to be in the many, the branch of the government that's closest to the sovereign is the one that might get out of hand the quickest. So they were worried about that. Well, they gave the president a power to stop that. They also, in the way our system works, the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. Other laws made pursuant to it might violate it. And I'll tell you where the courts get their power. Because let's say they pass a law that's unconstitutional. Let's say they pass a law that everybody left-handed has to be a slave for everybody right-handed. Now, that'd be good, I'm right-handed. But then somebody left-handed might just sue. And if the judge finds that the law is unconstitutional, then the Congress is checked, because he's going to do that over and over again, the judges are. And that means that although the Congress could pass the law again, the judges are going to keep letting people go because they're upholding a higher law than the law of the Congress. And that whole thing, you know, about how all of the parts of the system, including the people who make the system and who are sovereign in the system, are supposed to hold the Constitution and its system of government in respect. In fact, there's a very telling thing in the 48th, excuse me, my memory's failing me right now, but it's the 48th or 49th Federalist paper. I think it's the 49th. Madison takes issue with his friend Thomas Jefferson at the beginning of the paper because Jefferson said, look, every time there's a conflict in the Constitution, we should be able to go right out to the people and let them figure it out. And Madison says, no, you don't want to do it that way. because he says if they're always having to redecide matters of the Constitution, they'll come to think it's an easily changeable thing. And if you have a contest where two branches are in dispute and they take it to the people, the legislative branch will have an advantage. And then he says the people, because that's the branch closest to them, will kind of be like judges in their own cause. And then Madison says one of the most important things in the Federalist Papers at the end of this argument. He says, in that case, our passions would be driving. But it is our reason alone that must be placed in control of the government. Our passions must be controlled by the government. And that, by the way, is the classical definition, Madison knew this very well, of a good order in the human soul. And think what that means, by the way. That means that all these arrangements, including separation of powers, are being contrived not so that any class or group of people should have a special privilege to check the power of the many. It's so that one part of the many should be given the privilege and have an advantage in controlling the government. And think what all these things do. What representation and separation of powers do together is they mean that we can't act just instantly. In fact, in 2008, the country went one direction in an election. In 2010, they went a different direction. And in 2012, there'll be a decision. It might be a decision which direction for a long time. Who knows? But it takes at least three elections to get a decision like that. That means we got to think and talk about it before we settle it. And that is how reason acts. Did your mother, when you were little, I know mine did, used to say, I think you should just sit down and be quiet for a few minutes. You know, and implicit in the statement, maybe you won't be quite so stupid when you stand up again. Or not, maybe not stupid, although I could surely be that when I was a boy. And who knows about now. Maybe just angry, maybe just excited, maybe just carried away with myself. Everybody does that. Peoples do that too. So they're aiming for a thing like that. And to preserve the separation of powers, the fact that each of the branches of government and the state governments each have some power over the other, they figure out in the Federalists and in the Constitutional Convention, they figure out that's going to be healthy. Because that's going to mean, A, they're in competition with each other, and B, to get anything done, they're going to have to compromise and cooperate with each other. And at one point, Madison, in the 51st Federalist, writes one of the most important things about this system. He says that in this system, to keep there being a gradual concentration of powers in one branch, so the legislative branch really gets control of the president and orders him around. I'll give you an example of how that might have happened. After Lincoln was assassinated, the Congress was very full of itself because it won the Civil War, made up, of course, mostly of Northern people. And so they tried to run over a weak president, Andrew Johnson. And one of the ways they tried to do that, nearly impeached him too, one of the ways they tried to do that was they tried to take over his appointments so that everybody in the executive branch, that not only did he have to get their agreement to hire them, but they could fire them when they wanted to. So now all of a sudden the whole executive branch would really be working for them. And that's the kind of thing that they feared, stuff like that happening. And Madison says, and remember how we said earlier that in a system of limited government, that it works a little bit the way Adam Smith says a free market works. You can get interest of people lined up outside the government, and so the interest doesn't just produce, in Madison's explanation, the greatest quantum of self-interest, right? The most selves getting interested and getting served. It's something else. Madison likes to use the phrase, the permanent and aggregate interest of the community. In other words, a good thing can be done. Something that's right in the public interest, in the larger interest, and that emerges somehow from self-interest. Well, so the same thing works inside the government with separation of powers. Because Madison writes that these people are going to get elected to these jobs and they're ambitious and they're going to want to take over as much of the government as they can, and they're going to have to work with the others, and the others are ambitious too, and they're going to be in a kind of a struggle that's going to tend to bring them together. Ambition, he writes, must be made to counteract ambition. The interest of the man must be connected with the constitutional rights of the place. Think what that means. That means that I'll do better, Joe Blow, congressman, if I do a better job as a congressman. That was the idea. It may be a reflection on human nature that such devices should be necessary to control the abuses of the government. But what is government itself? And this is a very important phrase, expression in the Federalist Papers. What is government itself but the greatest of all reflections on human nature? If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If angels were to govern men, neither external or internal controls on the government would be needed. Isn't that kind of an echo of the appearances of God in the Declaration of Independence? And if you think about it, if you qualify human authority in a way that's designed to make it more reasonable and just, and you do that with the comment that men are not angels, aren't you sort of reminding men what angels are like? Isn't that an appeal up there? And you can't read the Declaration of Independence and notice the references of God to God without understanding that there's a certain humility in those references and also a certain determination to place oneself in the right as it would look to the eyes of God. And that means that we are not angelic beings, but among the earthly beings we are the most angelic of the beings, and the way we behave in the most angelic way is to remember the distinction between men and angels and respect that distinction. And that, it seems to me, is a sign of what they're after here, which is not just the lowest common denominator with these things, and not just the multiplicity. It is that, by the way. It is that, too. Self-interest. If, the best person, I'll read you something from Abraham Lincoln. And I want you to understand that the action of self-interest can be a very powerful force for good. Lincoln is arguing against slavery once, and he says, free labor argues that as the author of man, that's capitalized author, he means God, the author of man makes every individual with one head and one pair of hands, it was probably intended that the head and the hands should cooperate as friends, and that that particular head should direct and control that particular pair of hands. As each man has one mouth to be fed and one pair of hands to furnish food, it was probably intended that that particular pair of hands should feed that particular mouth, that each head is the natural guardian, director, and protector of the hands and mouth, inseparably connected with it, and that being so, every head should be cultivated and improved by whatever will add to its capacity for performing its charge. In one word, free labor insists on universal education. Now that's an interesting point, right? Because in the first part of that quote, what he means to say is, the best person to feed me if I'm hungry is me. And the second best person to feed me if I'm hungry is my mother. And she's not with us anymore, right? But the second thing he says is, we're going to try to build a society where everybody gets a chance to do that. And I will tell you something. We'll talk about this in the last thing. Universal education, there was welfare in the American Revolution, of course. All of the major things that we think are vital areas of public policy, if in fact they are vital, I argue, were taken care of in the American Revolution. But they were taken care of by means that were referred to as constitutional, and that didn't involve centralized rulemaking in the central government. And that means that you have a society in which you can harness self-interest to the strength of the society. And through these devices, you can help to prevent it from becoming malicious against the society. The government will be more reasonable, and therefore more like the angels or God would be. Not like them simply, but more like them, because these devices are employed to privilege and strengthen the better parts of our nature. That's just simply crucial to understanding how these devices work. And I'll just mention in passing here and talk about it more at the end of these lectures, that there was, in the name of a different set of principles of a different understanding of human nature and a different set of constitutional principles, a specific purpose to discard the separation of powers as a device of government. And that is very far along the way toward being accomplished today, especially in the regulatory agencies, which typically act as all three branches of government over the area of policy they govern. And this system is not, as I repeat, to breed selfishness and certainly not stalemate. They were trying to make a very powerful government, and they did do that. The government of the United States is the government that has won the two greatest wars in human history. And if you count the Civil War, also one of them, let's say 3 of the biggest 5 ever. It can act, but it is encouraged to be deliberative while it acts. And that brings me to my last point for this section. You can't understand the government of the United States without understanding the way that representation makes possible but also depends upon limited government. And here's what I mean by that. If you're going to locate sovereignty out among the people need to be a large and vibrant community, and they need to be independent and self-reliant. So they are not coming before the government as claimants, but as citizens. You know that expression in that great inaugural address of John Kennedy, ask not what your country can do for you, ask rather what you can do for your country. The idea was that citizenship was a contributing thing. And that meant that very important things would happen privately, and that they would also happen in local government, which had a very important private cast to it. Most of the people in local government for most of American history were mostly volunteers. Of course, it's very professional and very top-down hierarchical, rule-driven form of government we have today, and that was invented for reasons. They thought the reasons were good. Many still think they're good. And I want to say a word about how that limited government works. First of all, it protects private property, and that means that, you know, it's just true. Just as Lincoln said, if you put a whole bunch of people set to work to using their hands, their head to guide their hands to feed their mouth, it's amazing how much production you'll get. It's really incredible. People like to work like that. And they don't work as well. I mean, I find in the management of this college, it's better not to put rules on people. A much greater thing to do is to agree goals with them. And if you have rules, they should be general in their nature, like we're going to tell the truth, we're going to cooperate with other people, we're not going to, you know, we're going to be responsible. And those are the kind of rules that it's good to have them and it's good to talk about them, but you almost don't have to say them. Instead, agree with people what you're going to try to get done. And then as much as possible, let them figure out how to do it. Because it's incredible how much people like that and how much they get done when you leave things like that. That was a hallmark of American government for a very long time. In the 1830s, Alexis de Tocqueville, Frenchman, aristocrat, came and wrote a very important book about the United States called Democracy in America. Still one of the best books ever written about the country. And I have some differences with the book, but like most people who read it, I think it's brilliant too. And I'll read you one quote, and I think it's incredibly telling about the matter of limited government. I'll close with this. He's coming from France, remember, in 1830. France is one of the first centralized nation states in history. It's still a very centralized country. The European, he says, generally submits to a public officer because he represents a superior force. In other words, why do you obey the law? Because the guy walking up to you in a uniform can hurt you if you don't. But to an American, he represents a right. In other words, you see somebody working for the government, you think they work for you. They're here to defend our rights. Now what follows this statement? That's a stark statement to read, right? Anybody afraid of the government today? If you're in business and you're regulated, are you afraid? Tocqueville continues, in America it may be said that no one renders obedience to man, but to justice and to law. And then there's a kind of transition in the paragraph. If the opinion which the citizen entertains of himself is exaggerated, is it at least salutary? He unhesitatingly confides in his own powers, which appear to him all sufficient. When a private individual meditates an undertaking, however directly connected it may be with the welfare of society, he never thinks of soliciting the cooperation of the government. You know how this college was founded? It's in a little town in Michigan, founded in 1844. When it moved here to this town, Hillsdale, in 1853, this fella who worked here for 50 years named Dunn rode his horse into town, and he went to the local hotel. There were two, actually. He went to both of them, and he said, he went to the hotelier, and he said, I'm here in town. I want to move a college here to town. I would like to speak with the leading citizens interested in education. Right? It's a really pretty story. And they gathered in City Hall, which was already built at that time. And they had a long talk, and the one subject that never came up was that they were going to tax anybody to support this college. And they sat and negotiated for about 2 hours, and the guy said, this guy Dunn said, look, this is going to be this is an abolitionist college, this is a Christian college, this is a freedom-loving college. We dedicated our oldest building on the 4th of July. We're not going to have any distinctions of race. He said all that. If you want a college like that, we'd like to move the college here. You got to give us some dough. He asked them for 10 grand. The Hillsdale city fathers and mothers were sharp negotiators, and they offered him 15 grand on condition that he and the others that worked at the college would go out and match it. So he got on his horse and he went riding for 2 years, and they came back. We still have a list. He raised money, $3 and $5 at a time. Took him 2 years. And he came back with 25 grand. Hey, we were rich back then. And you see, they're in City Hall, but what Tocqueville says, however directly it may be connected to the welfare of society, and you know, a college that teaches the meaning of the United States of America, that's a public service. Madison and Jefferson said, you can't understand your country if you don't study the things we teach here. We teach them here in part because they said that. He never thinks of soliciting the cooperation of the government, but he publishes his plan, offers to execute it himself, and courts the assistance of other individuals, struggling manfully against all obstacles. Undoubtedly, he is often less successful than the state might have been, but in the end, the sum of these private undertakings far exceeds all that the government could have done. That's the spirit of American government of old. And you're never going to have a representative form of government whose powers are separated unless you have a limited form of government where very important things, including important things to the public interest, are accomplished by private action. And that's the glory of the United States. I mean, it's really amazing how that has worked through our history. And in a certain way, we're in an argument about two kinds of government. And in one of them, you're going to rely on individuals. And remember, I'm saying, acting in part always in their self-interest. People are going to do that. But according to institutions that refine that self-interest, and along, by the way, with precepts and principles like these up here, encourage people to act in the public interest too. And those would be central to the American constitutional system. And in a certain way, to comprehend it is to comprehend this set of ideas in their connection to this set of arrangements. That's the main thing. Thank you.